Search House of the Dragon on YouTube today and you'll find the same complaints over and over. It's too slow, nothing happens. The writing isn't as good as Game of Thrones. You'd think the show was another disaster waiting to happen. It isn't perfect. Some episodes drag, some choices are absolutely worth debating. And there are moments where the pacing could be better. But when people complain that the show spends too much time in council meetings or that it takes too long to get to the action, they're criticizing the exact thing that's keeping it from becoming late Game of Thrones all over again. Because we remember how that ended. Daenerys turned an entire city to ash in under an hour. The Night King, built up for nearly a decade, was gone almost as quickly as he arrived. We lost the version of the show where Tyrion negotiating with Cersei could be as tense as a battle, where a marriage proposal could reshape the political map, and where one bad decision could echo through an entire season. So when House of the Dragon was announced, I assumed it'd be a cash grab. More spectacle, more fan service, another story built around the Targaryens that would eventually collapse under its own weight. Then I watched it, and what surprised me wasn't the dragons. It was how familiar the storytelling felt. Not late Game of Thrones, early Game of Thrones. The slowness people complain about, the political conversations, the constant focus on who trusts whom and why. That's not the show forgetting what made the original work, that's the show remembering it. Because dragons don't make these stories work. It's the feeling that every dragon attack is the consequence of decisions people made years earlier. That's what makes them work. And the more I watched House of the Dragon, the more I started noticing three things it was doing differently. Three mistakes that nearly destroyed one of television's greatest shows, and the three ways House of the Dragon is quietly trying to avoid repeating them. The first thing House of the Dragon gets right is also the thing people most often mistake for bad pacing: politics. I've seen people describe entire episodes as just people sitting around talking, and they're right. The difference is that those conversations are the story. That's exactly how early Game of Thrones worked. Some of those important moments in the original series weren't battles at all. They were negotiations, marriage proposals, council meetings, and quiet conversations where someone chose one sentence over another, and that decision eventually changed the course of an entire kingdom. Back then, the writers understood something simple. Politics isn't what happens between the exciting scenes, politics creates the exciting scenes. That's the biggest lesson late Game of Thrones forgot. The first and biggest mistake the original show made was slowly replacing political logic with plot convenience. Early Game of Thrones almost never asked, what would be the coolest thing to happen next? Instead, it asked, given everything these characters want, what's the most believable thing that would happen? That's why the Red Wedding remains one of television's greatest twists. Not because it shocked people, because it made perfect sense. Robb Stark breaks his marriage pact with Walder Frey. Walder Frey wants revenge. Tywin Lannister needs a way to destroy the Stark rebellion. Roose Bolton sees an opportunity to back the winning side. None of those motivations were invented at the last minute. The show spent 2 seasons patiently building every piece until the betrayal felt horrifying, but inevitable. Go back and watch season 1. Almost every major event works the same way. Ned Stark dies because sense of honor puts him in direct conflict with the political reality of King's Landing. The War of the Five Kings begins because Robert dies before the truth about his supposed heirs can be exposed. The North declares independence because years of political abuse and betrayal have made loyalty to the Iron Throne almost impossible. Nothing feels random. Every consequence grows naturally out of a decision somebody already made. Then something changes. By season 7 and 8, it feels like the writers stop asking why events happen and start asking what needs to happen next. Characters begin arriving wherever the story needs them, regardless of distance or logistics. Armies cross Westeros in what feels like no time at all. Euron Greyjoy somehow becomes capable of protecting enormous naval power whenever the story needs him to, without the show spending much time establishing how that power was actually built. And then there's Daenerys. This is probably the biggest example. For 6 seasons, she's defined by one central belief. She wants to be different from her father. She frees slaves instead of ruling through fear. She locks away her own dragons after innocent people die, because she understands that power without restraint can be monstrous. Does that mean she could never become a tyrant? No. The destination isn't necessarily the problem. The problem is the journey. Late Game of Thrones compresses what should have been a gradual moral collapse into what feels like a handful of major beats. Instead of watching someone slowly convince themselves that they're justified, we're suddenly expected to accept that we've reached the end of the road. The ending happens because the story has decided it's time for it to happen, not because the character's journey has given us enough time to believe that we've arrived there. That's plot convenience. Now compare that to House of the Dragon. Almost every major conflict begins with one question: who has the legitimate claim to the throne? That isn't background world building, that's the engine driving the entire story. King Viserys names Rhaenyra his heir. On paper, the matter should be settled, except Westeros has centuries of tradition saying the opposite. The king's word says one thing, history says another, and neither side is completely unreasonable. That's exactly what makes the conflict interesting. Viserys spends much of the first season trying to hold those two realities together. People often criticize him for being indecisive. I don't think that's quite what's happening. I think he's one of the few people who actually understands how fragile the realm has become. Every compromise he makes is an attempt to buy more time. Every marriage he approves, every argument he postpones, every political concession he accepts. They're all attempts to delay a conflict he knows could tear his family and his kingdom apart. That's politics. Not flashy politics, real politics. The kind where solving today's problem often creates tomorrow's disaster, and that's what makes the succession crisis work. The show doesn't need somebody to suddenly reveal a secret document that settles everything. It needs people to interpret the same political reality differently. The clearest example is Viserys' final moments. When he's dying, Viserys believes he's speaking about the old prophecy and his dream of Aegon the Conqueror. Alicent, hearing him talk about Aegon, interprets his words as a final confirmation that he wants their son Aegon on the throne. Viserys never intended that. But by the time anyone can correct the misunderstanding, it's already too late. The important part isn't simply that Alicent misunderstood him, it's why she was capable of believing it in the first place. She already lives in a world where the idea of Aegon becoming king makes political sense. The misunderstanding works because the political conditions were already there. That's the difference. Late Game of Thrones often skipped this process. Characters trusted one another because the next battle required them to. Alliances formed because the story needed armies in the same place. House of the Dragon rarely gives anyone that luxury. Trust has to be earned. Promises carry consequences. Political mistakes don't disappear after one episode. They echo forward, which brings us back to the criticism that the show is too slow. If your expectation is that politics should simply get out of the way so the dragons can fight, then yes, it probably feels slow. But if politics is the story, then every council meeting, every inheritance dispute, every marriage negotiation, and every uncomfortable dinner is building pressure. The dragons are just the explosion. Politics is the fuse. And that's where the second mistake becomes important. Because once Game of Thrones stopped trusting political complexity, it also started losing its moral complexity. One of the reasons early Game of Thrones became such a phenomenon wasn't because it constantly shocked people. It was because almost nobody thought they were the villain. Tywin Lannister wasn't trying to become evil. He was trying to preserve his family's legacy. Stannis wasn't chasing power simply because he enjoyed it. He genuinely believed the throne belonged to him by law. Even Cersei, for all her cruelty, was driven by fear, pride, and an obsessive desire to protect her children. You understood why people made terrible decisions. Sometimes you even agreed with them. The moral uncertainty is what made the Westeros feel believable. By the final seasons, that uncertainty begins disappearing. The story starts needing people to fill simpler roles. Euron Greyjoy becomes chaos for the sake of chaos. He's entertaining, he's charismatic, but he barely resembles a real political actor anymore. He's less a character with understandable incentives and more an obstacle the plot can deploy whenever it needs one. Even Cersei becomes flatter. Earlier seasons portrayed her as someone constantly calculating 3 moves ahead. Later on, much of that calculation gets replaced with spectacle. The complexity that once made these people fascinating slowly gives way to a much cleaner divide between protagonists and antagonists. And that's where House of the Dragon surprised me the most. It refuses to give the audience an easy side to cheer for, at least so far. Rhaenyra isn't simply the rightful queen. Alicent isn't simply the evil stepmother trying to steal the throne. They're both products of a broken system, a system where two legitimate interpretations of succession can exist at exactly the same time. And this is where I think Rhaenyra becomes particularly interesting, because her conflict isn't just she's a woman trying to inherit a man's world, it's that she refuses to behave like someone who believes she doesn't belong there. Look at the way she carries herself. She rides a dragon. She puts herself in situations where most people would rather send someone else. She confronts Daemon directly. She takes risks that Alicent would never take. And when she's faced with a problem, her instinct is often to meet it head on, rather than retreat behind the social rules everyone else expects her to follow. There's something almost intoxicating about watching that. Not because Rhaenyra is secretly masculine, it's because the show gives her a kind of confidence that is traditionally coded as masculine. Aggression, physical courage, ambition, confrontation, without requiring her to stop being feminine to possess it. She doesn't have to become a different kind of person to be powerful. She simply refuses to accept the limitations everyone else has decided should define her. And that's a huge part of why I find her so compelling. It's the same basic satisfaction you get from watching someone who has been underestimated suddenly rise to a challenge that everyone assumed was beyond them. You watch them step into a space where they're not supposed to belong, and then prove that they do. Rhaenyra has that quality. But here's the important part. Alicent doesn't have to have it. And that's why the two characters work so well together. Alicent has learned to survive by working within the system. She uses family, marriage, religion, reputation, court politics, motherhood. She understands the rules because those rules are the only protection she's ever been given. Rhaenyra, on the other hand, keeps trying to push through them. One woman survives the system by mastering its rules. The other survives by refusing to accept that those rules should define her. Neither response is completely right. Neither response is completely wrong. And that's exactly what makes their conflict tragic instead of melodramatic. Think about Alicent for a second. If you've only seen clips online, you probably assume she's antagonistic. But look at the world she's grown up in. She spent her entire life being told that sons inherit kingdoms, that traditions matter, that stability matters, that questioning centuries of precedent could plunge the realm into civil war. Then Viserys names Rhaenyra heir, and later fathers multiple sons. From Alicent's perspective, the contradiction isn't just political, it's dangerous. If Aegon isn't crowned, what happens to him? What happens to her family? Whether she's right or wrong almost becomes secondary. Her fear is understandable. Now look at Rhaenyra. She spent years preparing for a responsibility her own father publicly gave her. The lords of Westeros swore oaths to support her. Every sacrifice she made was built around the assumption that one day she would inherit the throne. Then suddenly she's expected to accept that none of those promises matter anymore. She's not clinging to power simply because she's uniquely ambitious. She's fighting for something she was explicitly told belonged to her. Both women have legitimate reasons to believe they're defending the future of the realm. That's exactly why choosing a side feels so uncomfortable. Not because the show refuses to tell us who's right, because the system itself was never designed to survive the situation. That's a real tragedy. The conflict isn't created by an evil person making evil choices. It's created by ordinary people trying to navigate impossible circumstances. And that's something early Game of Thrones understood better than almost any fantasy series. Think back to Ned Stark. People often remember his death as proof that good people lose. I don't think that's why it works. Ned doesn't die because he's stupid. He dies because the values that made him an honorable lord in the north became liabilities in King's Landing. He's playing one game, everyone else is playing another. Nobody has to become a cartoon villain for that ending to feel devastating. The tragedy emerges naturally from competing values colliding, and that's exactly what's happening in House of the Dragon. Nobody sets out hoping to start a civil war. Everyone believes they're preventing one, and that's what makes the conflict so compelling, because every attempt to stop the disaster ends up bringing it closer. And that leads directly into the final mistake, because complex characters only work when the story is willing to give their decisions time to matter. If the first mistake late Game of Thrones made was abandoning political logic, then the second was simplifying its characters. The third was losing patience. Early Game of Thrones trusted the audience to remember things, years before they became important. Littlefinger didn't build his influence overnight. His schemes stacked on top of each other until you could barely remember where they had started. Cersei's prophecy wasn't mentioned once and forgotten. It lingered over her story for seasons. Even White Walkers spent years in the background, slowly becoming more threatening with every appearance. The writers understood that the payoff only feels satisfying when you've spent enough time earning it. By the final two seasons, that philosophy almost disappears. Problems arrive and leave within the same episode. Massive defeats barely leave lasting scars. Daenerys loses ships, armies are devastated, characters survive impossible situations, and the story quickly moves on to whatever needs to happen next. Consequences become temporary, and once consequences stop feeling permanent, the tension starts disappearing too. And that's one of the biggest reasons late Game of Thrones feels so different from the show that came before it. It wasn't just moving faster, it stopped allowing decisions to reshape the world. House of the Dragon goes back to that older philosophy. Almost everything happening now was planted long before it paid off. The succession crisis begins in the very first episode. It isn't resolved, it isn't forgotten. It quietly grows. Every marriage, every birth, every slight, every compromise, every public insult, every death. They're all adding weight to the same inevitable collision. That's why I don't think the pacing is actually slow. It's deliberate. There's an important difference. Slow storytelling wastes time. Patient storytelling invests time. Those aren't the same thing. When Viserys spends episode after episode desperately trying to keep his family together, some viewers see repetition. I see pressure building. Every failed attempt makes the eventual collapse more believable. By the time war finally arrives, it doesn't feel like a twist. It feels unavoidable. That's exactly how tragedy is supposed to work. You know what's coming, you desperately want someone to stop it, but every decision only pushes the story closer to the ending you already fear. The dragons are probably the clearest example. In late Game of Thrones, dragons often felt like solutions. Need to destroy an army? Use dragons. Need to win a battle? Use dragons. Need a spectacular visual? Use dragons. In House of the Dragon, dragons feel more like weapons that permanently change the calculation. Every time one enters a conflict, everyone understands the cost is about to become irreversible. And when a dragon dies, it matters. Not just emotionally, strategically. The balance of power changes. Military planning changes. Political calculations change. Nobody simply replaces what was lost because the next episode needs another action scene. The loss remains part of the story. That's what consequences are supposed to do. They don't exist to shock the audience. They exist to permanently change the world, which is exactly what made early Game of Thrones so addictive in the first place. Is House of the Dragon perfect? No, I don't think it is. Some episodes absolutely struggle with pacing. Some scenes could be tighter. There are criticisms of the show that I completely understand, but I also think a lot of people are asking it to be something it was never trying to become. They're comparing it to the spectacle of late Game of Thrones, when they should be comparing it to the discipline of early Game of Thrones. That's the version it's trying to emulate. Not the explosions, not the constant twists, the storytelling. Political decisions that matter. Characters who feel understandable even when they're wrong. Consequences that echo across entire seasons instead of disappearing by the next episode. That's why I don't think the biggest criticism of House of the Dragon is that it's slow. I think it's that we've forgotten what Game of Thrones originally felt like. Back then, nobody complained that there weren't enough battles in season 1. People came back every week because every conversation felt dangerous. Every alliance mattered. Every promise carried weight. The dragons weren't the reason people fell in love with this world. They were the payoff. The politics made them matter. And that's exactly what House of the Dragon is trying to rebuild. Whether it ultimately succeeds is something we'll only know once the story is finished. But so far, I don't think it's repeating Game of Thrones' biggest mistakes.